Opening the center immediately, staking a claim for early central influence. Opening the door for aggressive pawn play. The knight immediately contests the center and prepares for developing skirmishes. Establishing central control and preparing for pawn advances, white stakes a claim on key squares. Initiating fianchetto. The dark squared bishop gains a diagonal aiming for queenside pressure, potentially disrupting white's central ambitions. This pawn advance secures the bishop's long diagonal, preparing for a fianchetto and potential kingside attack. Developing the bishop to its natural outpost solidifies the fianchetto and prepares for potential central thrusts. Solidifying the fianchetto. White secures the long diagonal for the bishop, anticipating future queenside expansion or central pawn breaks. Challenging white's central pawn and opening a diagonal for the queen. A bold positional gambit for space. Sacrificing the pawn temporarily opens lines, creating dynamic imbalances for initiative. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight strategically repositions it, establishing a solid central presence and initiating piece coordination in this King's Indian setup. Developing the knight to f3 consolidates central influence and prepares for kingside castling, solidifying white's pawn structure against any immediate black piece pressure. A crucial repositioning of the knight. It seeks to influence the c4 pawn and establish a more active presence on the queenside, potentially supporting future queenside expansion or a central breakthrough. Securing the monarch against any immediate kingside threats is paramount. This castling maneuver achieves that while also bringing the rook towards the center. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies central control and prepares to contest white's queenside space, a natural response in this Catalan setup. Securing the center with a pawn advance. White solidifies control of key central squares and prepares to develop the remaining pieces, aiming for a harmonious setup before committing to more aggressive actions. Embracing the center aggressively. Black ignites a pivotal pawn clash, seeking to disrupt white's harmonious setup and open diagonals for their pieces. Unlocking the center with this pawn thrust decisively opens lines, creating immediate tactical possibilities and forcing black to confront the newly formed pawn structure. Liberating the queen from the central skirmish. Black opts for a bold queen sacrifice to disrupt white's development and seize initiative, aiming to exploit the open d-file and potentially launch an attack on the weakened king's side. Reclaiming the central file after black's queen trade initiates a crucial positional advantage, immediately pressuring black's underdeveloped queenside and opening avenues for further piece activity across the board. Reclaiming central influence with the knight establishes a dynamic pawn structure. Black aims to develop piece activity quickly while white's rook now eyes the d-file, hinting at potential pressure. Reclaiming the central pawn with your knight immediately simplifies the position, opening a clear path for your rooks and preparing to exert pressure on the now exposed black king. Reclaiming material is paramount, and repositioning the bishop to this active square immediately pressures white's central pawns, while clearing the path for the queen's re-entry into the game. Sharpening the knight's reach towards the queenside. This maneuver anticipates potential queenside pawn advances and prepares to contest the b-file, should it open, while also keeping an eye on the central squares. Fortifying the central pawn is a solid, albeit slightly passive, choice, aiming to secure that d5 outpost and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the queenside. Re-establishing knight presence in the center after the rook exchange frees up the f-file for potential pawn pushes or future piece activity, while simultaneously preparing to challenge black's pawn structure should they commit to further central advances. Shifting the bishop to g7 is a subtle but crucial repositioning, aiming to develop the piece to a more active diagonal where it can exert pressure along the h8-a1 long diagonal, potentially influencing the center and supporting future pawn breaks. This maneuver also prepares for potential castling on the queenside, creating a more dynamic pawn structure by avoiding the cramped position the bishop might face on the kingside after white's setup. The knight's repositioning to d4 aims to dominate the central squares, particularly e6 and c6, while preparing a potential advance to c2 or e2 to support a king's flank attack or a queenside pawn push, exposing the light-squared bishop to potential pressure on the long diagonal. This maneuver aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create opportunities on the queenside, though it does allow white to solidify their central presence, challenging black's influential bishop and aiming to solidify white's pawn structure. This move simultaneously opens a path for the f-pawn to potentially advance, creating future attacking possibilities on the kingside, reasserting the bishop's influence and preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside. The bishop retreats to a square where it observes the central diagonal and offers support to the knight on c6, solidifying control of the central dark squares. Now, white prepares to redeploy the bishop to a more active diagonal while simultaneously denying black's knight a potentially disruptive outpost on c4, unlocking the queenside with a pawn thrust. This advance injects immediate dynamism into the center, threatening to unravel white's carefully constructed pawn chain and opening lines for black's pieces, reclaiming the central square and preparing to advance the queenside pawns. This knight repositioning aims to unlock white's own pawn structure and potentially threaten black's central control, seeking to disrupt white's central control and infiltrate the queenside. This knight maneuver eyes the potentially vulnerable b2 pawn while simultaneously creating a mobile outpost, bolstering the bishop's influence along the long diagonal and preparing to challenge black's central pawn majority. This repositioning aims to create dynamic play and potentially exploit weaknesses on the kingside. Executing the capture on c3 now seems to be about simplifying black's structure and aiming for a more manageable middle game, potentially even an endgame, by eliminating white's active knight and clearing the queenside. Opening the b file with this pawn push creates an immediate imbalance in material count on that specific file, and while it secures the knight on d2, it also introduces a potentially vulnerable doubled pawn for black to target later on, solidifying the queenside pawn structure and preparing for a potential queenside expansion. This bishop's retreat prepares to contest the crucial c5 square while simultaneously offering protection to the b6 pawn, opening the central file for rook activity and preparing to contest it is a primary objective, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses. The castling into the storm, a bold decision, immediately injects radical imbalance into the position. By tucking the king away on the queenside, black implicitly declares that the central pawns are less important than developing an active counterplay, potentially aiming to exploit the open c-file or create a passed pawn on the queenside, all while accepting a slightly less secure royal haven than if they had opted for kingside castling, a trade-off that will define the subsequent skirmishes. Clearing the bishop's diagonal opens a path for potential infiltration along the c-file, a strategic advantage as the queens are off the board and the kings are castled on opposite sides of the board. Black seeks to activate their bishop, aiming to trade it off for white's potentially dominant knight on b3. This exchange, if successful, would alleviate some of the pressure on black's queenside and potentially open a diagonal for the Queen later. It's a subtle positional maneuver. A bid to simplify and create a more balanced middle game. Challenging the central pawn structure. This advance aims to gain space on the queenside and potentially open lines for white's pieces. But it risks creating weaknesses if black can exploit the resulting pawn tension. Embracing the pawn thrust. Black seeks to liberate the pinned kingside bishop and inject dynamism into the game, challenging white's centralized control and potentially opening lines for counterplay. Unearthing a vital defensive square. The king bravely advances to g2, preparing to join the central battle and potentially support a future kingside pawn push. A necessary initiative given black's encroaching presence on the queenside. Launching a pawn avalanche on the kingside. g5 signals black's aggressive intentions, aiming to disrupt white's seemingly solid kingside structure and potentially open lines for his pieces. This pawn push creates immediate spatial tension, forcing white to consider how to react to this flank initiative. Will it be a decisive breakthrough, or will it overextend black's position? A subtle repositioning aiming to liberate the bishop and prepare for future pawn advances on the kingside. Unleashing the pawn storm at the king's doorstep injects immediate chaos, forcing a dramatic re-evaluation of the central structure. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside. White immediately injects dynamism into a position that was becoming somewhat static, aiming to disrupt black's burgeoning attacking potential and expose their king. Opening the g-file presents a double-edged sword, immediately exposing your king to potential threats from white's rook and bishop while simultaneously offering a pathway for your own pieces to attack. This aggressive pawn thrust demands precise calculation to navigate the ensuing complications and avoid a swift collapse. Opening the f-file abruptly creates a dynamic, if precarious, situation. By sacrificing control of that crucial pathway, white offers black an immediate chance to exploit the opened lines leading towards the king. Reclaiming that bishop to a more active diagonal after the pawn exchange creates immediate threats to the c4 pawn, potentially disrupting white's queenside structure and offering counterplay opportunities. Trading off the rook on the 8th rank immediately resolves the tension on the open file and simplifies the board, potentially steering towards an endgame where white's queenside pawn majority might become a significant factor, though black's active bishop on h6 and passed pawn on f4 will require careful handling to prevent counterplay. Suddenly, the exchange of rooks on the d-file simplifies the position, shifting the immediate focus to controlling the open central files and preparing for a potential pawn storm on the kingside as black's initiative appears to be waning. Unleashing a rook onto the open g-file creates immediate pressure against black's kingside. A bold offensive posture aiming to exploit the currently uncastled king's exposed position. Reclaiming a pawn is a natural instinct, yet consider the long-term implications. This recapture immediately confronts the doubled pawns on the kingside, potentially creating an isolated pawn for black once white's bishop on f1 retreats. And it opens a direct line for white's rook to become extremely active on the g-file, directly threatening your now exposed king. Asserting dominance on the 7th rank. This rook injection immediately disrupts black's already exposed monarch, threatening a cascade of checks that will force concessions or direct material loss. Reinforcing the rook's position becomes a priority as the opposing rook now eyes the 7th rank, aiming to infiltrate black's defensive structure. Initiating the exchange of rooks now is a pragmatic decision, simplifying the position and steering towards an endgame where white's active rook and potentially more consolidated pawn structure could prove advantageous. while also removing black's powerful rook from the central files it was beginning to influence. The king's escape from the battlefield of the center to the relative safety of the queenside signifies a pivotal shift towards the endgame, accepting a slight structural concession for crucial mobility. Advancing the king's pawn here opens up the possibility of creating a passed pawn on the kingside later, while simultaneously restricting black's king's movement and potentially creating mating threats down the line if white can coordinate pieces effectively. Seeking to reignite activity and challenge the entrenched pawn chain, this knight hops into a more active central square, aiming to harass white's kingside pawns and potentially create mating threats. Repositioning the bishop to its diagonal allows white to keep an eye on black's potentially advancing kingside pawns while also preparing to contest control of the central files should the opportunity arise, subtly building pressure. Steering the monarch towards the center now presents a curious dilemma. Does it enhance offensive potential or invite an early foray from the white bishop into vulnerable territory? Shifting the king to the center aims to solidify its position against potential pawn storms and prepare for a more active role in the ensuing endgame. The king embarks on a daring central expedition, immediately confronting the pawn chain and threatening to disrupt white's remaining structure. The king's march is accelerating, a bold stride pushing into enemy territory, aiming to shatter the calm and create chaos for the opposing monarch. Securing the king's flank with a pawn move like this is often a reasonable, albeit passive, defensive reaction. It aims to provide a potential escape square or a barrier against immediate threats on the H-file. But it also commits black to a somewhat cramped position, restricting the king's mobility for the rest of the game. This move doesn't actively fight for central space or open lines, which might be crucial for creating counterplay in the current endgame scenario where white holds a slight initiative due to the better pawn structure. Consider if there were more dynamic alternatives, perhaps involving piece activity or aiming to complicate white's plans. The monarch ventures forth from its sanctuary, initiating a daring maneuver to contest the central square and activate the king's presence on the queenside, potentially initiating a race or creating counterplay against black's somewhat exposed royalty. Liberating the bishop from its pawn guard allows it to eye the kingside, creating potential mating threats or forcing concessions from the enemy monarch. Preparing to challenge the bishop's reign on the long diagonal and potentially activate the rook through the d-file. The bishop re-establishes its defensive post, a crucial anchor for the king's shelter as the queens vanish from the board and the pawn structure grinds forward, suddenly confronting the isolated black king. The bishop's deployment to g6 creates immediate pressure, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and potentially trap the enemy monarch, setting up a scenario where even passive pieces might become targets. Capturing the pawn creates an immediate tactical dilemma for white, forcing them to address the exposed light squares around their king and potentially weakening their pawn structure on the queenside.